Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another webinar under the name SEB LU Contributes. Today we will host three highly distinguished guests on the topic of organizational adaptation in time of crisis. The conversation will be led by Professor Tamara Pałastoci-Trost. And so at this moment, I would like to ask dear Professor to start sharing your camera and unmute yourself. And the word is yours.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, Luca, for the introduction. Hi, Samir, and hi, Vaughn. It's lovely to see you after what, about 10 years that we haven't seen each other. So it's my great pleasure to host this webinar with two of my graduate school friends who ended up going actually in a similar direction. We all happen to be at business schools of some sort or the other. So I will first tell you a little bit about the webinar that we're going to be having today, and I will introduce the speakers, but I'll try to keep it short so we can go straight to hearing what Vaughn and Samir have to say. So today we'll talk about uncertainty and adaptation and what businesses can do to adapt to crises like we just had. We saw with COVID that many businesses actually did have to do massive layoffs. Some businesses went under. Other businesses were able to adapt in pretty interesting ways. So we're really going to try to ask not only how were businesses able to be, or an organization successful in dealing with the COVID crisis, but also if we've learned anything about some strategies for long-term ways of planning for uncertainty. And where Vaughn will come in is also to tell us, is this something that we can build in as a feature, not simply just adapt when crises come along. And in addition to both Vaughn and Samir being studying adaptation to uncertainty, I'm also hoping Vaughn will tell us a little bit more about how uncertainty relates to innovation, and Samir about how ambiguity and uncertainty also affect things like relationships, social networks, firm performance, and other things. So what we're going to do today is first I'll introduce both of the speakers, and then we'll talk first a little bit about the research, then a little bit about the COVID crisis and some lessons learned there, and then we'll move a little bit broader into what companies can do to prepare long-term. So let me first introduce Vaughn. So Vaughn Tan is an assistant professor at the University College London School of Management. He has a PhD in organizational behavior from Harvard University in 2013. And his dissertation was actually on intentional ambiguity. So it seems you could have written a recipe for dealing with COVID while you were writing your PhD. So Vaughn also writes a weekly newsletter on uncertainty in daily and organizational life. And he contributes to journals like The Atlantic, but more importantly, he has an incredible book coming up called The Uncertainty Mindset, which is due to be published in next month, right, with Columbia University Press, which actually deals with how the restaurant industry has dealt with uncertainty and how it continues to innovate. And he also has a couple of other interesting projects that we might not have time to talk about, including desperation by design. So how you actually can build in designing a project that actually stimulates innovation, and productive discomfort. So if we have time, we'll get to these topics too. Then let me move on to introducing Samir. So Samir Srivastava is an associate professor at UC Berkeley. He teaches at the Berkeley Haas School of Business and in the Berkeley Sociology Department. He also has a PhD in organizational behavior and sociology from Harvard University and an MBA from Harvard as well. And he works more on cognition and interrelationships between culture of social groups. He's written for the Journal of Sociology, American Sociological Review, and other very impressive journals I don't need to list. And maybe before he moves to the topic of uncertainty, he can also tell us a little bit about his other work on cognition, cultural cognition, language, diversity and firm performance, and so on. And I almost forgot to mention it's 8 a.m. at Berkeley, so I'm extra grateful to Samir for waking up early to join us. And then finally, before I give the floor to Vaughn, one other thing I wanted to say, and one of the reasons I'm actually employed at the University of Ljubljana School of Economics and Business, and why I invited them, is because I'm also a sociologist working at a business school. And one of the things I find most interesting is how actually the lessons that we learn from times of crisis very frequently end up being more readily answered by sociology and related disciplines than from business itself. And here I wanted to highlight one of the things that I've also been pushing for at the School of Economics and Business is adding other sociological approaches to studying business. And here, maybe if we have time, it would be really great to hear, because both Samir and Vaughn have done ethnographic research. Vaughn has worked with restaurants, restaurant crews, analysis of reviews of employees of their companies, and so on. So what are the other kinds of ways we can learn about how businesses are doing that are not purely economic performance related indicators? So I will give the floor now to Vaughn.
Great. What would you like me to talk about? I can talk about the book or...
Yes, so maybe you can start off with telling us with the book and some of the main things you found out in the restaurant industry, and then later we can broaden this up to uncertainty in general.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks for the invitation. The book is called The Untitled Mindset, and it looks at primarily restaurants and how they think about the future, and specifically that they think about the future as something which they don't really know what will happen in the future, right? So that way of thinking about the future as being fundamentally unknowable, it changes the way they organize themselves. It changes the way they hire people. It changes the way they motivate their teams. It also changes the way they set goals. And what I find in this book, which I think applies not only in the restaurant industry, but outside. I used to work in tech. And to me, it feels very consonant with how technology companies work, is that if you're expecting the world to be uncertain in the future, you design yourself differently so that you are better able to deal with that expectation, versus expecting the world to be fundamentally knowable in the future, in which case you kind of take a risk management approach to it. So that's basically the book. I mean, I can talk in much more detail, boring detail about it if you want, but we don't have to talk about that. I'm actually very curious to hear how this conversation plays out between like you, Tamara, and you, Samir, because I think I have a weird perspective on things, and I'm very curious how all these different views of what organizations should do under uncertainty kind of play into each other. So yeah, the book actually, in theory, is out this week in the US and out at the end of next month in Europe. So okay. You all posted on that.
Okay, and can you maybe just tell us a little bit about how you studied the restaurants, and maybe what are some of the main conclusions, or do you not want to give that away yet if the book isn't out yet?
I'm very happy to give it away. So I mostly, for the book, I studied them ethnographically. So I spent time at these restaurants, just basically standing around. In some cases, I also washed dishes. And the idea was to understand how people in these restaurants work, but also by watching how they work, try to understand how they think about the way they work. So some of the insights in there, I won't go into lots and lots of detail, but I think one of the insights about how they think about, for instance, hiring, is that they don't think about hiring for a fixed job scope the way, you know, if you are in an HR department. So I used to do hiring when I was at Google a little bit. And the traditional way you hire is you write a comprehensive job description, and then you go out and you search for people who kind of fit that job description. And you interview them and you do some other tests on them to figure out who actually fits the best. And then you hire the person who fits the best. What I found, which I think is very consistent with not just the world of restaurant hiring, but also with high performance team hiring in professional services firms, for example, is that instead of assuming that you know what the job description will be, they say, okay, we know that here is a threshold level of what we know people who are in this job will have to do. The rest of it, we're going to kind of leave open-ended, right? So I call them open-ended roles because part of the role is understood, but part of the role is not. And as a result, because there's the expectation that part of the role is not well understood, it's up for grabs. The process of getting hired by one of these companies is about negotiating what your role will be and learning what makes sense for you as the potential employee and what makes sense for the organization that you're trying to join. And in a way, I think I'd love to hear what you and Samir have to say about it. In a way, what that does is it creates employees whose roles are constantly adapting and constantly responding to what the organization as a whole needs. so that you don't have this problem of hiring someone for a fixed job description. And then the business environment suddenly changes, for instance, with COVID, and their job descriptions aren't changing. And they're expecting that the job descriptions don't change. So what I saw in these restaurant teams was a way of hiring that produces a team of people whose roles are really kind of, they're soft, they're malleable. And so when the environment around the organization changes, these roles flex and adapt in response to that. It's like a naturally adaptive way of building a team of people. So that's one of the examples. And I can talk more about the other things, but I feel like we should hear from, Samir,
Okay.
and I'm very excited to hear from other people about that. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I have a whole list of questions for you, but yeah, let's hear Samir, and then maybe we can try to work these two together. So Samir, maybe if you could first give us a couple of kind of highlights of your research, and then we'll move to COVID and uncertainty.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Tamara, for inviting me, and great to see you, and great to see you again, Vaughn, as well. So just a brief overview about my research. Broadly speaking, it's focused on new ways of measuring culture and social connections or networks inside of organizations. And if we think about how we have typically thought about, like both conceptually, but also methodologically, ideas such as culture, we've often thought about it as a relatively static construct. And we've often measured it using things like surveys or sometimes ethnography, which is a super valuable tool. But it's difficult to observe everybody at the same time and over periods of time. And similarly with surveys, it's very difficult to get granular time-varying measures of how an organization is changing. So a lot of the work I've been doing over the last 5-6 years has been focused on really harnessing digital trace data and trying to find cultural and network signals in digital trace data. So what I mean by that is, for example, the digital traces that people leave every day, throughout the day, in their emails or in their Slack communications or on Glassdoor. So people are communicating in ways that are revealing something about their own culture and how that culture matches that of the people around them. So I'll tell you about one research finding and try to connect it a little bit to what's happening right now and also to the comments Vaughn just made. So in a tech firm that we have data from, we were able to develop a language-based measure of individual level cultural fit. So cultural fit is something that's talked about a lot. And as the work of Lauren Rivera, one of our former classmates, who's a professor now at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, shows, in many cases when people are hiring for cultural fit, what they're really doing is hiring for social similarity. And if somebody is similar to them on some known dimensions, they're coding that as cultural fit. So what we've done in this project is to first come up with we think, a more objective way of measuring cultural fit, which is the match between the style of communication that someone has in his or her outgoing messages relative to the incoming messages that he or she receives. So the idea is that people learn how to match the styles of people around them, and that's a behavioral indicator of their cultural fit. And when I say styles, I'm thinking about categories of language. For example, pronoun use. In some organizations, using lots of I language as opposed to we language can be countercultural because it signals that you're not a team player. Whereas in other, for example, financial service firms, if you don't use enough I language or swear enough, then you're really a bit of a misfit. So people learn this kind of cultural code and adapt to it. And the way this connects to what's happening right now and to what Vaughn just said is, in our data at least, it turns out that if you're forced to choose between somebody who is a high level of cultural fit to start, but slow to adapt and learn, versus somebody who's perhaps less well-fitting to start, but is a quicker study, you're much better off choosing the latter person, right? So it's less that, and that's because cultures evolve and shift, and particularly during pandemics and crises, they change often pretty dramatically. So one of the key features we find to select on is cultural adaptability, the ability to kind of read the cultural code, see how it's changing, and then quickly adjust to it. So that's one example from my research. The other quick one I'll highlight, this is a very recent project. This one is not yet published even, but it's about the COVID crisis. And it also highlights the importance of norms in cultural adaptation. So we know throughout the world, but particularly here in the US, that governments, state and local governments have put in place various directives around sheltering in place and which businesses are essential and which businesses can open up and how. And yet there's tremendous heterogeneity in how firms are responding to these directives. Some are complying with the directive, some are proactively making changes, and others are really deviating from the policies. And one of the things we examine in this more recent paper is the role of social influence in those dynamics. So we could think at a local level, at a very local level, about two broad kinds of establishments. There are community-based establishments that are owned and operated and embedded in the local community. And then there are national chains that happen to operate in that local geography. And what we do in this project is we take advantage of cell phone tracking, location tracking data based on cell phones to look at foot traffic across different establishments. And from that, we can get pretty precise indicators for several 100,000 establishments around the country, at least in the US, of when a particular establishment is open versus closed. And we can also look at the national policies of national brands to see the dates on which they announced their closure decisions. And from that, we can develop what's called an instrumental variable technique, which is a way to get a causal estimate of the influence that national chains have on community establishments. And what we show is that even though community establishments are often more embedded in and care more about the health and well-being of their local community, they're nevertheless susceptible to social influence from the national chains. And when national chains remain open in defiance of state and local policies, the local community establishments around them are also likely to follow suit. And so what it suggests from a policy perspective is the importance of both coordinating policies with the national brands, but also really sort of focusing surveillance and monitoring resources on these national chains because of the spillover effects their behavior has on other local community establishments. So let me stop there and we can pick up on any of those topics as we go forward.
Okay, can I maybe, Samir, just ask you to just introduce one more article that I thought that also relates to what we're talking about today from 2015 on network dynamics in times of ambiguity and what we know about relationships between workers, because that then will take us back to also what Vaughn was talking about in terms of also, because quite a few from our audience are looking for leadership tips on what this means for leaders and managers and how they can manage teams better. So maybe if you tell us a little bit about these network dynamics, the formal and informal ways people communicate, and then we can tie that back in with Vaughn's insights from the restaurant industry.
Sure, happy to. I'll do this briefly. So this was a project looking at an organizational restructuring in an organization where that restructuring was mostly unanticipated, at least the implications of it were not that well known. And therefore it created a fair amount of ambiguity about how to make sense of and interpret what was happening around people. And when people are faced with uncertainty or ambiguity, there are these two competing forces that tend to operate, right? There's one set of forces that leads people to want to revert back to what's familiar and comfortable. So it's quite common under conditions of uncertainty or threat for people to revert to traditional familiar routines, including routines about whom they're interacting with, even when the situation might actually call for them to do something very different, right? So there's this idea of threat rigidity, for example, which is that we tend to just enact these familiar, comfortable routines. The other force, though, is that we're trying to make sense of something unfamiliar and difficult to grasp, and that leads us to want to get some novelty in our understanding of what's going on. So these two competing forces lead to some very interesting network dynamics, right? So people will tend to reach out to new and unfamiliar relationships in some domains, but to do that while maintaining some familiarity in other domains. And we get this kind of bifurcated response at the individual level, but we also see this at like groups and teams levels, and even at the broader organizational level. And in some cases, these dynamics can be adaptive because they're helping us to kind of broaden and to get social and get social support. But in times, if they're not done more deliberatively, if they're done just more automatically, they can also lead to people being cut out of useful information flows that might be helpful to them.
Okay, that's great. Okay, so that ties us actually pretty neatly back into Vaughn's restaurant industry, where I'm hoping he'll share a little bit more of his insights so we don't have to all go buy the book in 72 hours or whenever it's available. And also because the thing that both of you are kind of touching on, and later maybe we'll get to Samir's strategies for dealing with uncertainty, is that Vaughn mentioned that you developed a planning tool that can help businesses plan. And so maybe if we can talk about these two levels. So at the one level, planning at, let's say, a company level that doesn't take into account these soft things. And then we also just say we, at the School of Economics and Business, we just added a new course last year that's called International Business Societies and Cultures. And we're trying to add this soft dimension where, you know, we're talking about things like network dynamics and also invisible labor and other things like that. So this will be also really good for our students to hear. So maybe at that softer level, because everything you two have talked about so far has been at this much softer level. And then the harder indicators of firm performance, since both of you have also looked into this. So if a firm, you know, is not convinced by sociological research, doesn't care. So at some firm performance level, and then at the softer level, in terms of hiring, dealing with employees. So you can tackle either of those levels, because I know that both of you have worked at both. So maybe Vaughn, you can tell us first a little bit about the tool you have, and then maybe tell us a little more on the softer leader management tips.
For sure. I do want to get to what Samir was saying about how individuals respond in situations of great ambiguity. But after, I think there's a connection to that. So this tool that I built, I mean, calling it a tool, I think would be maybe overstating or stating very strongly. What it is it's just a spreadsheet. And what the spreadsheet does is it gives people who use it a push, basically. It's an opportunity to think in a realistic way, because you can immediately see the financial implications of particular business models that you might be trying, while also giving you the opportunity to experiment, I guess, cognitively with different business models. So the reason for this was because I work with a lot of small businesses. And one of the things that I found in the last 3 or 4 months is that businesses tend to not think creatively about things that they can do to respond to clear and present uncertainty. Not because they're not thinking creatively, but because they're thinking creatively, but in a way that's not rooted in realistic knowledge that they already have. So one of the things that I heard again and again was that businesses and restaurants are just some of the, like non-restaurant businesses are also in the same situation. Businesses that are thinking about how to respond to a situation where they don't know whether or not they'll be able to have people come into the store, they don't know whether their supply chains will be disrupted or not. They do not know some things, but there are some things that they do know are impractical to expect. And they're not, in a sense, imagining possible business models that take into account those realistic pieces of knowledge they already have. And the reason why they weren't doing that was because for many people who are, you know, sole proprietorships or small businesses, they don't necessarily have the, you know, the technical manpower, like a financial bit of your organization that does business modeling. They don't have those internal tools and resources to think in this maybe more rigorous, but at least slightly quantitative way about the effect of doing things differently as a business. So the tool is basically just to do that. It's not meant to be a super rigorous business planning tool. What it's meant to be is it's meant to be a very quick, you can do it in 20 or 30 minutes, way to understand how, if you change your business model in particular ways, it may affect your business bottom line in particular ways. And I think the connection to what Samir was saying in my mind is, one thing which I found about in the context of restaurants was that the restaurants that were most effective at continually innovating were the ones that used this kind of situation of desperation, which I think Samir is alluding to, strategically, right? So organizations can be built so that they, randomly get hit by uncertainty. Like if you're not prepared for it, then something like a restructuring or like a business environment change like COVID can hit you. And as a business, you don't really have the capacity to deal with it because you weren't planning for it. But the alternative, which I think gets to a question that you posed, was if as a business you design yourself so that you're actually creating uncertainty along the way, and you're in a way almost training your organization and the people in your organization to deal with some of the cognitive and affective challenges of dealing with uncertainty, right? So I think, Samir, you mentioned that one of the things that people do in these situations is to, in a sense, flee back to comfort and security, to establish routines. That's definitely this threat rigidity that Samir mentioned. I think it's a real problem. And especially when the threat is so overwhelming that there's really nothing else you feel as an organization or as an employee you can do, that becomes like the reason why businesses get paralyzed in a situation like the one we're facing today. If, on the other hand, what you do is you systematically, at regular intervals, create situations under your own control where you push people into circumstances that are unknown, that cause a bit of desperation, what you do is you actually train them to do this sense-making stuff that Samir was talking about, I think. You train them to be put in a position where they have to reach out for new information, new connections, discard processes that don't work anymore, ways of working that are maladapted, and build new stores of knowledge that may be adaptable for right now, and new ways of working together that may also be more adaptable for right now. So I think one of the things which I'm trying to do, and I suspect Samir is trying to do too, although I don't want to speak for him, is to understand what kinds of things you can do as an organization to create those conditions where you can respond to uncertainty more gracefully, in a way that's beneficial for the organization and people inside it, rather than respond to it with paralysis or collapse.
Okay, can you maybe give a couple of examples of what could a company do? Let's say things are going great in regular times. What are some examples of how does this look, trying to build this in and teach your workforce to be adaptable? So maybe a few examples or some.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can talk about it in the context of restaurants, but I think maybe an example in a non-restaurant context may be more real for more people, because very few people probably work in restaurants who are listening to this. So imagine you're a large advertising agency, and you have a deep stable of established clients, and you're a retainer with them, right? So you expect them to come back to you every year and spend their advertising dollars through you. I think in that situation, which many of the big advertising agencies more or less are in, it can be very comfortable to simply say, okay, we're going to do more or less the same types of campaign ideas. We're going to implement them in the same kinds of ways, because we know that they kind of work from the past. Now, what you could also do if you wanted to do something like what I was suggesting is you could intentionally design some of your pitches, some of your campaigns to be things that you don't know how to do, and that you don't know that you're good at, that could fail. Right, so those three characteristics, the fact that the project that you design might truly fail, that's one step towards creating a situation where the people who work on that project don't necessarily know what they are supposed to do or what the desired outcome should be. They are not in settled times in that project context, and they may have to learn. So what I found in looking at these restaurant teams, which I also see from looking at teams in software development or also in advertising, is that you don't just need to have a project that could really fail. You need to have some other things attached to it as well. So you need to make the project, as the leader, you need to make the project something which is deeply committed to. And one way you can do that is to announce it publicly and to make sure that there is real consequence to failing. So if you imagine two situations, one of them is you've got a project idea that could fail, but there's no consequence to failing. Like your customers don't expect you to succeed. Your customers have not pre-bought the service. The implications of failing are not felt viscerally by the people who are working on the project. On the other hand, if you've got a project that could fail and you've already sold it to a client for a date that must be delivered at some time in the future, and they've already paid for it, all of a sudden it becomes real, right? So I'm not saying as a business, commit all the time to projects that are so overwhelming that it causes you to collapse both at the individual and at the team level. But what I'm saying is there is value to creating these kinds of projects that create desperation if they're carefully calibrated. And this is something I'm very curious to hear Samir's views on. What I found was you need to, as a leader, be in close enough affective touch with your team that you can understand when their level of anxiety and desperation is high enough that it indicates that it really is pushing them to do something they don't know how to do yet, but not so high that it will cause some of the threat rigidity responses that we normally see when teams are overwhelmed, right? So you know that that Carl Weick article about basically about young men in fire, like the Man Gulch disaster. You don't want to always be creating desperation projects that cause teams to collapse and then in some cases literally die. You want to create projects that are desperate enough that it triggers learning, it makes organizations flexible and then allows them to adapt without causing all of the downsides that overwhelming projects cause.
Okay, great. Samir, did you want to jump in since?
Yeah. First of all, I want to 100% endorse everything Vaughn just said. I think what he's describing is a way of building what I think of as adaptive capabilities inside of organizations. And one other practice, which is closely related to what Vaughn was talking about that I want to emphasize, is the role of organizational simulation. And what I mean by that, the best kind of analog to this is thinking about wargaming in the military, right? So good military teams practice the conflict before it happens. And in practicing different ways in which a conflict might evolve, they're doing two things. One is they're starting to prepare cognitively for what different future worlds could look like. And the second is that they're building cohesion as a team. They're building trust with one another, learning about each other's capabilities. And so this idea of organizational simulation is something that I think organizations can and should be doing all the time. And it's particularly important right now with the COVID crisis, because although things are opening up in different places at varying rates, no one really knows what the future world's going to look like, right? It's almost now cliche to talk about it as an unprecedented level of uncertainty, but it is. And we just don't know what the world's going to look like. So, you know, if you think about a company like Sephora, which is the cosmetics firm, you know, some of their investments they made right before the pandemic in like augmented reality systems that allow customers to kind of try on makeup and you know, different products virtually and see what it looks like on their faces. Those investments are turning out to be really prescient, right? Because this is, I think they may be helpful not just in the short term as Sephora and other companies come out of this pandemic, but they may fundamentally change the way that their customers are engaging with them in the long run. And so when I say a simulation, what I mean by that is getting a cross-section of the workforce together. It's not everybody, but it's not just the senior people. It's a broad swath of the organization together, typically done in a day or a couple day long session. It can be done in a shorter format if need be. And it involves a few different steps. So step one is thinking about what are the 3 to 5 big uncertainties that we are facing that are industry and firm specific. Some of these might have to do with the rate at which the economy opens up, but a lot of these are going to be much more fundamental. Like, how are customers going to engage with us differently? What are the big uncertainties about that? Then, having identified the 3 or 4 different uncertainties and states of the world that we might imagine, we start putting those uncertainties together to construct scenarios of the future. Again, these are not just about the healthcare environment, but they're more fundamental scenarios about what the world could look like. And part of this is going to what Vaughn was saying about helping your teams push themselves out of their comfort zone, right? To imagine worlds that they're not familiar with and the challenge that comes with that. And then starting to think about, okay, so if we are in this world, then what would be the right organizational response? How would we need to change our investments? Which businesses are we going to pull back from? What new businesses are we going to invest in? What new partnerships do we need to form? How would we think about what the structure of the organization would look like, what the roles and responsibilities would be, the decision rights, and you actually like work through some specific examples. Imagine a customer came to us with this kind of requirement, how would we respond? And you kind of simulate the organizational response under these different scenarios, and you pressure test these different designs. And then you think about, if we were in this world, what are the capabilities we need to build? This kind of exercise is super helpful in getting the organization to think beyond the current state, to push itself outside the comfort zone, as Vaughn was saying, and again, to build cohesion so that when the organization actually does face a new or changed reality, they have some broader cognitive muscle, some collective muscle to think about and respond to those changes.
Yeah, can I just say something really quickly in response to what Samir was saying? I 100% agree with the importance of scenarios and using scenarios. And I'm not sure if you meant it, I suspect you did, that it's not really that you need to even correctly identify the scenarios that you're responding to. What you're using the scenarios, the scenario creation process and thinking through process for is to help understand how the organization is put together internally, so that that kind of thing, which is normally not clear because the way you do business normally is business as usual, it conceals all of these ways that the organization fits together that may fall apart when the situation changes. And if you are able to create scenarios that stress test those ways of working, that allows the organization to understand how it actually works, so that it's more likely to be able to work well when the environment changes around it.
That's right. This is not about getting an accurate forecast, but it's about building kind of the capability to adapt.
Yes, 100. And that, I think that probably is, for me anyway, that ability to adapt, which involves both the ability to detect what's going on outside, as well as change what's going on inside. That's probably the most important thing for an organization in a situation where the environment's changing constantly, right? Which is the one that we're facing today.
Right. So do you maybe on that topic have any examples that come to mind, either from the UK or from the US, of companies? So you mentioned before a bit of companies that were very well equipped to handle the crisis, and companies that seemed like they would be, but ended up failing. It's obviously too early to really make some conclusions on that, but if you have any examples or lessons that could be taken away, or particularly good or bad ones, that would also be interesting.
I mean, some of the companies that have been talked about so far as being, quite adaptive would be, for example, Cisco, a food distribution firm that, pretty quickly built up an entirely new supply chain and billing system in less than a week to start serving grocery stores differently. We're seeing a surge in demand for platforms such as Tongle and Topcoder. Tongle for creative video work and Topcoder for on-demand tech talent. So these are examples of firms very quickly adapting to different ways of sourcing talent than they have before, and changing supply chains. So those are some of the examples that come to mind. I think one of the most interesting examples to think about is the university setting. So we're all connected to universities that are having to pretty fundamentally rethink what our business model is, if you will, and what it's going to look like even after this next semester or next couple of semesters. And I think we're starting to see, it hasn't like fully been implemented yet, but a lot of universities are exploring some, I think, pretty innovative practices, like, do we move to, for example, a subscription-based model rather than having students come for a finite period of time and pay a fixed tuition, to turn the business model into more of a subscription of on-demand learning that can stretch out over longer periods of time? Or can we create a digital transcript that can be ported across institutions and again, over time, so that you can kind of pick up where you left off over the course of a career, or various kind of AI techniques for supporting learning. Things like Georgia Tech has been experimenting with Jill Watson, which is a virtual teaching assistant based on IBM's Watson platform. or AI-based grading, right? These are all the kinds of things that universities are experimenting with and thinking about, which could pretty fundamentally transform our own business models. Juan, what have you come across?
Yeah, I've been actually really looking much more closely at what very small businesses do, because I think the big corporations are they're in an interesting situation because they're more likely to have the kinds of capital resources, cash available to ride things out for a little bit before they try and figure things out. I think from a very kind of pragmatic standpoint, very, very small businesses, like the ones that are significantly smaller than, I don't know, like 100 employees, they generally make up the vast majority of all businesses anyway. And so I've been looking at how businesses like that can respond. I think the thing that marks success, and to Tamara's point, we don't really know what has been successful yet long-term, what will be successful. The thing that seems to mark success is when businesses start to experiment as quickly as possible with doing things differently. So I think there's basically at least, but there's definitely two ways a small business that doesn't necessarily have deep bank accounts can respond to the situation that they're facing. One of them is to say, okay, we'll take whatever government aid is available, and we'll temporarily shut down, and we'll hope for the best. We're going to wait until things go back to normal, and then we'll operate the same way as we did before. Generally, that seems to be a really bad idea because, as Samir said, we have no idea whether or not things will go back to normal, and we have no idea how long it will take for that to happen. The businesses that do well, and I can think of several, like one of them is a restaurant that I have been looking at for a while in terms of how they do some other things, where they said, okay, we're going to shut down for a week just to figure out how to make the space safe for employees. And then the moment we reopen, we're going to start to add progressively, in an almost experimental way, a new business offering, basically, every week or two, and be very rigorous about experimenting with it, right? Like start with a hypothesis about how much you can sell, what the cost of goods sold might be, what the profit rate might be like, and then consciously test it as you introduce it into the market to see whether or not that works. If it does work, keep it and add a new line and test that. And then just keep building up a new business model that is robust because it's built up during this time to the conditions that hold during this time. And I think my sense for that is I would call that being realistically imaginative, right? You're imagining a new thing you can do with your business model that is realistic in the sense that you're actually testing it out against what the reality is right now. And for the ones that tested it during serious lockdown, like the most intense physical lockdowns that are likely to be in place, at least here in the UK, what they know is they've built a business model or parts of the business model that are robust to those conditions, which are probably going to be the worst that they will face in terms of physical lockdown for the next 18 months. Whereas the ones who didn't try it out don't know. And then when things maybe oscillate between, physical distancing at a very high level versus not very much physical distancing at all, it's unclear to me that they will have the capacity to make their business models respond in a way that allows them to survive. Yeah.
But could I add one?
And maybe.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
I was going to add one comment to what Vaughn just said, and also add a separate point. So, one thing I wanted to amplify is this idea of experimentation, which I think is important not only for small businesses but really for all organizations. So now many firms are quite used to the idea of A/B testing when it comes to their websites, right, and various designs of their online platform. But we don't yet have standard practice of doing A/B testing when it comes to the organization, when it comes to our offerings, when it comes to how we're configured and designed. But there's really no reason why we couldn't do that. And we would get, rather than just piloting a new offering or piloting a new way of working, we can run at scale rigorous A/B tests and get much, much better evidence than we've ever had. And this is a place where I would just suggest that there is untapped opportunity for businesses and universities to collaborate. Because from a research perspective, having a good randomized controlled trial is one of the best ways to advance knowledge. And I would argue it's one of the best ways to advance practice. So there's, I think, significant opportunity there. One other quick thing I wanted to mention, as Vaughn was talking about, trying out different ways of working. One way of thinking about that is to flex, if you will, the structure of the organization and the work processes. And that's something that a lot of organizations are doing right now. So we have, in many organizations, overlays that are being put in place. When I say an overlay, it might be a crisis response team or a COVID, strategic response team. These are very useful kinds of entities, or an innovation team that gets put in place to think about how are we going to respond to the new world that we're all going to be living in. Those flexible structures and processes are super helpful. But one of the things that often gets lost as we are experimenting is the importance of tightening decision rights. What I mean by that is it can be very easy with the proliferation of new structures and changes in work processes for confusion to set in about who is really responsible for getting something done and who's going to be in the end accountable. So while we're flexing structures and processes, I think it's equally important to clarify and tighten and communicate and reaffirm the core decision rights, who's responsible for what. And that's one way to strike the balance between adaptation, but also having some kind of accountability for getting results done.
I also agree with that completely. That part where I think one of the problems with crisis response is that in a crisis, a lot of the things that people do normally, which include things like clear understanding of who gets to make decisions on what and who's accountable for what, those tend to get not thrown away, but they're left by the wayside temporarily. And if they're left by the wayside permanently, that reduces organizational efficacy thereafter, right? So I think Samir is completely on point. The efforts to adapt and respond need to be, in a sense, you need to anchor them in understanding how action still takes place inside organizations. If you don't do that, then the organization becomes very, very much less capable of acting effectively, which is what they need to do right now.
Yeah, Vaughn, I think we're agreeing too much. We've got to find something to argue.
It's so boring when we only agree on that.
Okay, so maybe let me ask something, going back to the very beginning of our talk. So, and you also just mentioned that if we're talking about small businesses, at least, you have two options. One is, try to hunker down, write it out. The other one is to actually adapt, innovate, experiment, risk, and so on. Do you maybe think there are certain features of organizations that make them more likely to pick one or the other? Is it something that comes from leadership, or that comes from the structural features of the organization, or is it mainly the CEO or the culture of the company, or are there maybe cross-national differences in this, or type of industry, or what could explain differences in how? I mean, it's just a thought. I know you.
Yeah.
We don't have research on this yet, but just what are your thoughts on what might make companies react in one way or the other?
I think you're right.
And I guess the same applies to big companies as well. I mean, they have a different set of issues, but you could also see in the bigger corporations, certain managers that were, forcing employees to work with their cameras on, trying to make sure everybody's still working the same amount of hours, trying to ignore that there's, a crisis going on. And then managers that were very, very flexible. So even in the bigger corporations, there was a difference in how local management approached dealing with the crisis. But if we want to stick to the smaller companies for now, if you have any thoughts on if there are built-in features to organizations or the leaders themselves.
I have some very preliminary thoughts. I'd actually not yet thought seriously about it because I haven't done any systematic research, but my gut intuition, I guess, says that especially for small companies, like the smaller they are, the more important the principal decision maker is in deciding whether or not they simply try and stick around and hope for the best, or they actively try and change the things that they do to try and adapt, right? So I suspect that, and I'm very curious to hear what Samir says about this in relation to big companies. From my time at big companies, it feels like they have a slightly different challenge because, as you point out, there's at the very top level what the entire organization does, and then inside, at various levels of control inside the organization, you also have what each one of these groups will do. So there may be something to do with what leaders at whatever level they're at, whether they're the sole leader, I guess, in a small organization or one of a hierarchy of leaders in a large one, whether or not they choose to try something out or choose to hope for the best. I think one thing that I'm pretty sure does affect this is whether or not the business, whether the business has like human capacity for change. Like the thing that seems to make it possible to even think about doing something different to adapt is understanding that your team, whatever that team is, right, that has to do the thing, understanding that your team has the capacity to change what they do. And I think one of the obstacles to doing this in large corporations that hire traditionally is that you hire people for particular job scopes. The expectation is that that's what they will do and that's a stable job description. In a situation like that, without even thinking about it consciously, I would imagine it'd be hard to think about how you would pivot your team. If pivoting your team means all the work that they're normally supposed to do is no longer the work they're supposed to do. So probably something along the lines of recognizing the adaptability of your team as a resource. The more you have that resource, flexible people, goals that are open-ended enough, the more likely it is that you are to be experimenting with new ways of working to respond to the crisis.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I mean, I think in some sense, the perhaps unsatisfying response to your question is it's both, right? We definitely see the role of leaders in spurring their organizations to adapt or change, or conversely to sort of stay the same. I think smaller businesses, generally speaking, have less flexibility to stay the same. There's more pressure to adapt because survival is so much more important for them, whereas larger firms have often some buffers and some ability to withstand those shocks for some period of time. But I think it's also important to note that when the world is in crisis, as it has been, that the normative order that really shapes how organizations behave and respond really can begin to unravel. And when it begins to unravel, that doesn't mean that people don't follow norms. It's just that people, in many ways, norms become more important. People start to look around and say, so what's the industry I'm in even now? Am I still in the restaurant industry, or has that really shifted? Who are my competitors? And who do I look to think about how one ought to respond, how one should respond? And so I think a lot of the change gets spurred by this, by firms starting to look outside, trying to think about who their reference groups are in new ways, and then following the norms that they're seeing happening around them. So I think a lot of that change, even for small businesses, comes from the outside world rather than just from inside.
Okay, great. So I'm assuming that neither of you agree with some of the discourse we've seen in the US, which of course is this very market-based kind of, which companies weren't able to swim during COVID, it was their fault, because if you go under after 2 bad months, right, maybe your company or your organization isn't fit for the market, right? So it's okay that you went under because this is just the market functioning how it's supposed to function. I'm assuming you don't agree with this kind of standpoint for small business especially, or how much do you think in terms of actual financial planning, so not just the soft team planning, experimenting and so on, should small businesses be prepared to handle? Or is failure in times of COVID a sign of organizational failure, or sometimes simply something where nothing could have been done? Either of you.
I mean, my quick view is that some of the firms that fail, it's probably going to be a reflection of creative destruction. They were kind of maybe weak to begin with, and there'll be some amount of weeding out of marginal players through this. But I also think it would be a mistake to assume that all of those firms were marginal players. Some of this is just a function of bets that firms made in certain capabilities, which might turn out ended up being not well suited to the world we're entering in, but in ways that they could never have anticipated. They may have been really well run and well managed, but the world played out in a way that didn't play to those strengths. And I wouldn't necessarily attribute that to weakness or kind of a failure on the part of that team.
Yeah, and unsurprisingly, I agree with what Samir said. I think it's very tempting to look at what individual firms in an industry or in an economy are experiencing, and if they fail, to say that they weren't doing the right thing. But it seems more important now than before even to think about them as kind of like a population, where within a population, different firms will be taking different bets, as Samir put it, on strategies that they think work, right? So they may be strategies that work for their particular niche, or they may be strategies based on how they understand the current business context. And it's exactly this, not exactly, it's very analogous, I guess, to how humans, every person is different, and every person has a different strategy to kind of attempt to make best use of the resources that person thinks he or she has, as well as accommodate the constraints that he or she thinks the environment poses. Sometimes through no fault of your own, some very reasonable hypothesis about that correct strategy works and you're very successful. Sometimes, again, through no fault of your own, it doesn't. And sometimes you're just lucky and the strategy was stupid, but you were successful anyway, right? So I think the idea that you can look at whether or not you succeed or fail and say the thing that you did, the strategy was good or bad, is fraught with a lot of like conceptual problems. So it probably makes more sense to look at how they're run and then try and, as Samir was saying, understand whether or not their failure was because of something which was unavoidable and unpredictable. And then I think maybe that goes to a deeper question, which is, should businesses have more buffer so that they can have more time to learn how to respond in the situation that we're facing, which is an unpredictable, quite dramatic shock to the way the business environment works? I guess it would be very hard to say that that's a bad idea. And I think that this is a much broader discussion, which probably we don't have time for today, which is that I think generally the business environment pushes firms and people to be much closer to optimizing high efficiency, very, very low slack, very low buffer than is wise, right? So we should be more willing as a society to accept a little bit of what I would think of as productive inefficiency so that we can be more robust, I guess, when things change dramatically, which I suspect will continue to happen more and more in the future rather than less and less.
Thanks. Samir, any last thoughts on Ron's points?
I think I mostly agree, but I think it's also very difficult. The part maybe I will slightly disagree with Vaughn about is, I think it's very difficult to know what is productive inefficiency that's about, helping you prepare for an uncertain world versus just, plain inefficiency that's gonna keep you from being competitive with the leaner competitor that's out there. And so in some ways I worry a little bit about licensing firms too much to build in too much slack, because it can become an excuse for largesse as well.
Yeah, for sure. Rent seeking.
Yeah.
Yeah. I not advocating rent seeking or encouraging it, but I think that there definitely is a problem when, in general, we interpret success as being, I guess, maximum efficiency rather than understanding that we need to maybe do a bit of a trade-off between efficiency and the capacity to adapt, right, when that capacity is necessary. And it's impossible to know how to do that. We're not trained as scholars or as a society to know how to do that yet.
Right. Yeah, and I think since both of you seem to agree, one of also the things that I'm hoping, because so Vaughn, you're in the UK educational system and Samir is in the US one. I'm at a public institution in Slovenia, and I think one of the big things that we also need to ask is how much the educational system is still kind of breeding or producing people who are not the educational system is not preparing students to be future workers that are adaptable, right? Or innovative or creative. And not just the university system, already the public education system, right? From the industrial era. So to think about what are we doing to people already much before they come to these companies, so that many of the workers are not adaptable, and the managers later, right? Since, and I'm really hoping this is one of the things also at my school we'll continue to do, is pushing the understanding of what works at these non-efficiency optimizing levels, but at the level of the people and what they're ready to experiment with. And also in Slovenia, we joke a lot that the culture is such that mistakes are not okay, right? And failure is not an option. So people are very risk averse generally. Even we don't like to generalize, right, culturally, but in general, a very risk averse society. So how to kind of move beyond that, so that in the business world we have leaders who are actually able to follow the advice that the two of you just gave us. And unfortunately, we're out of time. So I would ask both of you, if you have any last comments or conclusions you'd like to share.
Samir?
I just wanted to conclude by thanking you again, Tamara, for inviting me to participate in this. And I guess if I had to leave everyone with one last thought, it is building on what Tamara just said about the importance of experimentation, which necessarily results in some failure. And I think that's an important thing to come to terms with, to embrace, and even to celebrate as firms look to build the capability to adapt.
Yeah, and I mean, for me also, thank you so much for the invitation. I think probably, again, sort of riffing on what Tamara was saying and what Samir is saying, it seems like education really should be the place to learn how to be good with failure, because there is no other time in your sort of life as an adult where the stakes are so low, right? Like in school, if you fail, so what? Whereas if you fail when you're the leader of, I don't know, like a public health agency or a Fortune 500 company, then it actually is consequential. So we should probably train people to deal with failure and uncertainty where the stakes are low, so that they learn how to deal with it there, so that when they're in situations where the stakes are much higher, they are more able to deal with it in a way that is graceful and responsive. Yeah.
Okay, great. And that's a very great note to finish. And I'd like to really thank both of you, Samir, for getting up at 7 a.m. and Vaughn also for sharing some insights from your book before it's out. We're really looking forward to seeing it, and when you start promoting the book to learn more. Thank both of you again for participating. I hope we stay in touch. See you at a Harvard reunion soon. And thanks to the School of Economics and Business for organizing this webinar for us.
Yeah.
Thank you
So much.
Great.
And thank you again, you're all. Thank you again for being with us today, and we hope you have learned something new. Because we have no other questions on our YouTube live link, we are concluding this webinar, and we are inviting you all to follow us on our webpage for further webinars. Dear guests, thank you again so much for your contribution, and I wish you all the best and some healthy days. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.